Good day to you, and right here I'm holding part of my morning ritual, the newspaper. Probably not part of your morning ritual because I'm in a different demographic when this was part and parcel of our lives, the newspaper thumping into the driveway, picking it up and reading it at the breakfast table is part of an everyday occurrence. I want you to take a look at the general layout of this newspaper. It's the Pocono Record. It's from East Stroudsburg and Monroe County, those areas. And look at the size of the headlines, the photographs, the text. One story in here in particular that I took great note of was Wolf seeking GOP votes. The Pennsylvania state does not have a budget, has not had one since it was supposed to be passed back in July, and right now there's finally a possibility that the Republicans and Democrats may be able to agree on a budget. And that has a big impact on many of you in this class because you're sitting there without the proper financial aid that you're supposed to have because it hasn't been released because there's no budget. At any rate, this starts our chapter today, which is on newspapers. And as we seek to talk about newspapers, we're going to start with the history of newspapers. And the very first newspaper in the world came right after the Gutenberg printing press that we talked about in the last class. That newspaper was called the Couranto, and it was published in Amsterdam in 1618. And it was different from newspapers today because it contained mostly foreign news, which is not unusual. If you've ever been to Amsterdam, you know that it has a lot of people and ships coming into that small port city. So it's very normal that most of the focus would be on what's happening in the outside world. The newspaper was government controlled, by the way. It did not have freedom to publish what it wanted to. Here in the colonies, we have the very first newspaper being Public, with a K on the end, Occurrences, in 1690, and that newspaper was published only one time because it was shut down by the British government for criticizing the King of France. So again, a newspaper that doesn't have control over its own content. Now to circle back to Ben Franklin, and this time really his brother James Franklin to start with. James Franklin in 1721 published a newspaper called the New England Courant. And in that newspaper, he criticized the governor of a New England state and was promptly put in jail for criticizing the governor. So Ben Franklin took over the newspaper and used it to learn the skills of the newspaper industry, and Ben Franklin actually purchased his own newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette. He purchased that newspaper in 1729, Ben Franklin did. Now, at this time, newspapers were not what we would consider to be newspapers today. They didn't have headlines. They didn't have lead stories. They weren't even, for the most part, factual. What they were was a lot of political essays. They were very opinionated, and often they were aligned with a political party. You would have a newspaper that would be strictly speaking for a particular political party. Well, this all started to change in the 1830s when a new publisher by the name of Benjamin Day started to publish a newspaper called the New York Sun. Now, this is a really remarkable time period for newspapers because the Gutenberg printing press had been updated technology-wise with the steam engine. And that means now the printing press can produce papers much more rapidly. They can produce them like that, and the cost came down. Just like you find any product, when you can produce a lot more quicker, the cost comes down. And so he started to produce a new kind of newspaper that came to be called the penny press. It only cost 1 penny. It didn't cost $1, $2 like other newspapers out there. It cost $1 because it was much cheaper. This also made the newspaper much more accessible to more people because they could afford it. And in particular in the 1830s, since industrialization was occurring, especially in New York City where this newspaper was published, you have a lot of immigrants moving to the United States. Those immigrants did not have English skills like native English speakers, and so they were looking for a newspaper that had very basic information that they could not only understand, but would help them learn English. So Benjamin Day appealed to these kinds of readers with very simple stories, big headlines, lots of pictures, and most importantly for journalism, he moved away from opinions in the newspaper and moved towards reporting facts. And that's actually why we have most newspapers today, and really all media in the United States that report news, trying to follow the objectivity directive. That means trying to be objective instead of being opinionated. And Americans in general get really upset when they read a newspaper and they think, oh, it's so opinionated, because they expect it to be like Benjamin Day's newspaper was, full of facts. And the reason for that is if you want the biggest audience possible, you're not going to have a lot of opinions, a lot of liberal opinions, a lot of conservative opinions. You're going to stay with facts. Otherwise, you're going to have members of that audience saying, I'm not buying this newspaper anymore. So that was really a fundamental change. Now we're going to enter what we call the Wars of Yellow Journalism, and it occurs because of two publishers. The first one was William Pulitzer. Hopefully you'll recognize that name. William Pulitzer, it's his last name that's used to award journalists who are excellent with the Pulitzer Prize. So William Pulitzer was born in 1686. He actually came from Austria in Europe. Came to the U.S. and he decided to buy the New York World. He served in the military here in one of our wars, and he purchased a St. Louis newspaper first, and then he decided to move to New York, and he purchased the New York World, and he changed the format of newspapers. He started to offer big headlines, some of which you see a little bit in today's newspapers, like this one here. That's a big headline, right? But he published really big headlines and fewer words. He also came up with a concept that was considered as above the fold. And that means the most important story goes above the fold, just like this one is here. The most important story in the Pocono Record is ringing in the giving season. That's what they say is the most important story in this paper, so they put it above the fold of the newspaper. Pulitzer also started to publish women's stories catered to women's pages that catered just to women's interests. And he also published romantic fiction, which also catered to women. So for the first time, the female reader is being appealed to. And in fact, he used a female journalist, one of the first, to really promote a certain style of journalism in his paper. Her name was Nellie Bly, B-L-Y. And she started to do undercover, dramatic, sensational journalism. Her most famous story was going into an insane asylum, getting committed as a patient, and then secretly taking notes in diary style, and then getting out of the insane asylum and writing a series of articles on it. And that was very interesting, very dramatic, very sensational for a newspaper to run. It helped get him readers. Well, another gentleman who participated in the Yellow Journalism Wars was William Randolph Hearst, H-E-R-S-T. He was raised in San Francisco, and he decided also to buy a New York newspaper. He bought the New York Journal. And he started to try and compete head-on with the New York World. And the reason that these are called the Yellow Journalism Wars is because it's named after a cartoon that they both used to run called The Yellow Kid. And so, at any rate, that became a name for the style of journalism, which was sensational, hard-hitting, really over-dramatic journalism. And so one of the things that he constantly covered in his newspaper was the situation with Cuba and Spanish immigrants there, and it being an outpost for Spain. And some say that his newspaper fueled the Spanish-American War, the war between the U.S. and Spain. And if you've had a history class, you've studied that, but there was a lot of gun battles on boats in that war. And typical of William Randolph Hearst and his mission for promoting sensationalism is there was a reporter that was in the Caribbean. He was stationed there, and William Randolph Hearst contacted him and said, "What do you have for the newspaper today?" And the reporter says, "I don't have anything." And he said, "It's very quiet here." And William Randolph Hearst said to him, "Well, you supply us the photos, and we will supply the war." Now, isn't that interesting? It's kind of saying it's going to trump up the war. So those are the Yellow Journalism Wars, kind of a seedy period in American journalism. And in fact, Pulitzer later expressed a lot of regret that he participated in that kind of journalism. Anyway, their kind of journalism did calm down a little bit. The American public kind of soured on it, but it didn't go away completely. A newspaper that picked it up but toned it down somewhat was the New York Daily News, still going today. It's a tabloid. It opens like this. It's not a broadsheet that opens like this that then you open up. It's a tabloid. It opens like this. It's meant to be read on the go. You can read it in the subway. You can read it on the bus. You can read it as you're walking if you want to. So that newspaper had a style of journalism that was called jazz journalism because it was supposed to be flashy. Right now, the book takes kind of a sudden departure away from newspapers, even though this chapter is on newspapers, but the chapter goes next into broadcast news. It's a questionable judgment that the author organized his book this way, but in some ways it makes sense because broadcast news started to develop at the same time. So we're going to introduce it slightly here, though we won't circle back to it in full until later chapters on radio and TV. At any rate, in 1920, you actually have the very first radio broadcast being a news broadcast. right here from Pennsylvania in Pittsburgh. The station was KDKA, and it broadcast the Harding-Cox election returns, two guys running for president. And so radio news changed the scope and scale of news in general, because now news could be live, could be as it's happening. Also, news could include sounds from the events that were being covered. In fact, some of the very first coverage in the 1940s in broadcast news was Edward R. Murrow, a reporter who went to cover World War II in Europe. And when he would broadcast his news reports, he would include air raid sirens and children crying and broken glass from bombs. Totally different kind of news, really forced newspapers to change a lot of what they were doing. We'll discuss that more later on. TV news comes not too far after that. 1944 is the first sort of recorded television newscast. It was actually the Republican convention. It was a kind of a test way of delivering that information on this box that had moving pictures and very grainy black and white picture quality to it. That was television in 1944. As a quick departure here, think about if you're watching any of our debates on television, what is new to those debates? What is being broken through this year? Is it Facebook questions that are being asked of candidates, for example, as we see Donald Trump and others field questions? Is it a way that the set is set up so that you have all the candidates and then the national anthem is being sung before that? You know, where you're seeing breaking history right now in the same way that the people of 1944 saw breaking history when TV was covering the Republican convention. It wasn't until 1948 that TV networks, we'll talk about networks later and what they are, started to broadcast 15-minute newscasts. That was a big deal. 15 minutes every night. Wow. And then in 1963, that was up to 30-minute newscasts, which is what we still have today. The nightly network newscasts on at 6:30 on ABC, CBS, and NBC is all 30 minutes long. So newspapers, they had to compete against radio and TV news because news became a business now. Just like we've already established that in this country, most media are private, profit-making enterprises. News is just one kind of content that's supposed to be making money. That's why you have commercials in the middle of news. And so newspapers, having to compete with radio and TV as well as later internet sources, they started to form big businesses like we talked about in the last couple classes. They formed their own conglomerates. You've got the Gannett Company, you've got the Tribune Company, you've got the New York Times Company. These are big publishers that own both smaller newspapers all across the country, but they also own printing plants. So if you're a small town newspaper in the Allegheny section of Pennsylvania, you want to publish, maybe the only game in town is to publish at a USA Today printing plant. Now, speaking of USA Today, let's go through some of the major newspapers we have in this country. USA Today was the very first national newspaper in the U.S. 1982 is when that started. Just think about it. We're still a country trying to find its national culture, its national identity. It wasn't until 1982 that we had a newspaper that somebody in California reading it would find it just as appealing as somebody in Vermont reading it. How amazing is that? 1982, the first national newspaper. It was criticized, USA Today, for being about McNugget news, because it had a lot of really bright color photos and very small news stories. In fact, the newspaper was designed to look like a TV show in its layout. It's changed a lot since then. It has gone more in depth and it has more substance to it. Next up is the Wall Street Journal, known as the country's premier financial newspaper. We've got the Washington Post, known as the country's premier political news newspaper, and the newspaper also that saw the downfall of one of our presidents, President Nixon, when it exposed corruption in his administration as far as spying on his Democratic campaign counterparts. We've also got other newspapers across the country, most notably the New York Times, which is called the paper of record in this country. It's the most prestigious newspaper. It's known as a liberal newspaper, but one thing about it is when it publishes a story, all the talk shows are talking about what that story was. And then we've got the LA Times, the Los Angeles Times, and that newspaper is known for trying to raise the profile of minorities, which caused a lot of controversy because it's said to sort of pollute the journalist selection of newspaper stories because they have to go out and find minorities to cover whether there's news occurring or not. It's a controversy. Moving away from those big newspapers, we have scores of community and suburban newspapers all across the United States, like the Pocono Record. They still have a heartbeat within each suburban community. Many people are looking at them for anything from the school lunch menu to the weather to local people you know who are in trouble with the law. Newspapers are still very vibrant at the local level. Then also now we're going to turn to the alternative press. This is a different kind of newspaper. These are newspapers that go against the mainstream. We have several African-American oriented newspapers. The Freedom Journal from 1827. The North Star, which was published by Frederick Douglass. That's a name that you may know. We have a Frederick Douglass Institute here at ESU. Both those newspapers, as well as the Chicago Defender, another one, trying to promote equality for African Americans, erase segregation, provide the ability to vote, highlight differences in the treatment of African Americans when it comes to racial justice, just like we're still trying to grapple with today, and then all the horrific stories we have about police arrests and black victims of those arrest situations. Not taking sides here, but pointing out it's still an issue. Then also as an alternative press, we have the Spanish language press. The most important newspaper is the Miami Herald, or El Nuevo Heraldo, which is the New Herald in Spanish. It has the largest circulation at 800,000. We had a history of gay press in this country until it moved over to the internet. The most important paper there was the Washington Blade, which raised a lot of profile for AIDS and other issues that homosexuals faced, and even eventually paved the way for same-sex marriage. And now that takes us to news and society. News and society is about the larger issues of newspapers, just like we talk about for all of our chapters. And we know that there's a struggle here for newspapers in terms of who has control. Is it advertisers or readers? Same thing that we talked about last time for books. But it's different in newspapers because ads get placed right into the newspaper. And there's sort of been an old tradition. You never place an ad on the front page of a newspaper. That tradition continues with the Pocono Record. It doesn't continue with all newspapers. But as soon as you get inside a newspaper, you start to find ads. And just looking at this page right here, you can see a huge chunk of the page is devoted to advertising. And in fact, when you lay out a newspaper, you actually place the advertising first. And then you decide where are the stories going to go. So there's a continuing controversy about who has more control, advertisers or readers. Also, there's a controversy about journalists risking lives to cover stories for newspapers, especially in the Middle East. Iraq is the most dangerous country to report from. We have journalists being held right now hostage in the Middle East as a way of the terrorist groups trying to exert control over their own publicity. By capturing someone, you can raise attention for your cause, is the thinking. So it's not necessarily a safe profession, and even if it's not something that's life-threatening, you constantly have people trying to bully you into not reporting bad news on them, especially if it's going to affect their business or their movement or their reputation. Now that leads us to the final question for today, which is the newspaper a dying medium? Well, it certainly is a medium that's been going through a lot of struggles for many years because a lot of newspapers have had to put their information online, and as we have noted earlier, readers just do not expect to pay for newspaper information. So for a long time, newspapers tried to go with a subscription model. Some still do, like the New York Times, to get their revenue that they need to pay the bills. But most newspapers are going towards a system where they have advertising that's on the front page, and that's going to pay for the content. The difficulty is attracting that advertising. Okay, so there you have it. That's going to wrap up newspapers and this chapter. And now, using my helicopter hat, I'm going to fly away. Have a great day.